Hello, everyone. Welcome. I want to begin by playing you a little something.
After the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet? It's after the end of the world. Don't you know that yet?
We'll let Sun Ra go on a little bit behind me. Welcome, everybody. I am Deborah Thomas. I'm the director for the Center for Experimental Ethnography, and I want to invite you all to Doomsday FieldNets, which is a speculative and futuristic collaborative work by our center's fellow, Christina Knight, and her sister, choreographer Jessie Knight. Just to let you know, this is the first of two events from our fall 2020 fellows. Steve Feld's event, Hearing Heat, will take place next Tuesday at 5 o'clock. And if you haven't already registered, you can do that on our website, www.ceepen.org. You'll see the poster and there will be a link that you can click to register for the event. The center's theme this year is Futures Unbound, and we had come to this theme at the end of a spring semester that was made challenging because of COVID, and that became even more challenging throughout the summer. And we wanted to really signal a liberation from convention and a refusal of the categories through which we've been asked to define ourselves. And I think once everything was turned upside down in terms of our normative academic lives and our social and familial lives, it became that much more obvious that we had to speculate on what kind of world we wanted to bring into being. So by naming ourselves this year, Futures Unbound, we really wanted to gesture toward new possibilities, toward a drive to bring something different into being. And of course, this has become even more urgent as 2020 has progressed. So we see in our fellows this fall in their work a similar gesture and a similar drive. And we have the privilege today to hear from Christina and Jessie about the most recent iteration of their work together, work that charts new Black futures through the lens of ritual practice and Black feminism. So I'm gonna, in a minute, I'm going to introduce Christina and Jessie, but before I do, I want to offer some thanks. I want to say thank you to Elisa Jordan, the Center for Experimental Ethnography's postdoctoral fellow, and she's really been so much more than a postdoc. She's been really central to building the center, to building our processes, and to sort of making us into a robust existence, not just an idea. I also want to thank Annie Lindner, who's our administrative assistant, and she will sadly be leaving us at the end of the semester as she graduates and moves on to greener pastures. Of course, we're also thankful to the Department of Anthropology and to the schools and programs that house our incredible and incredibly committed affiliated faculty. And we also thank the provost and the president's offices who help to make our interventions possible. All right, let me turn to introductions. Christina Knight is Assistant Professor of Visual Studies at Haverford College. Before joining the Haverford faculty, she was a Consortium for Faculty Diversity Postdoctoral Fellow at Bowdoin College, as well as a Ford Foundation Diversity Fellow. Knight's work examines the connection between embodied practices and identity, the relationship between race and the visual field, and the queer imaginary. She's currently completing a book manuscript that focuses on representations of the Middle Passage in contemporary American visual art and performance. And Christina is also at work on a new project that examines the influences of drag culture on contemporary Black art. Jessie Knight, her sister, is a dancer, teacher, and choreographer from Pittsboro, North Carolina. After graduating from Duke University with a self-designed dance degree with an emphasis in music and education, Jessie embarked on a teaching and choreographing career that has afforded her the opportunity to teach, choreograph, and perform both locally and nationally. She spent 4 years in Denver as a member of the internationally acclaimed Cleo Parker Robinson Dance Ensemble, and she currently resides in North Carolina, where she continues to choreograph and perform on a project-by-project basis for her company, which is called Nightworks Dance Theater. So while Christina has been a fellow with us this semester, she, along with Jessie, taught a course called Black Speculative Futures. And I just wanted to take a minute to share what some of their students have said about their experience in the class. So these are quotes, and I've condensed some of them, so you should know they were quite effusive. Learning from Christina has been such a profoundly validating experience for me as an artist, a scholar, a dancer, and as a Black woman. I've learned an immense amount about the practicality of Black radical imagination, while at the same time learning to imagine and embrace the impractical in my own work. Moving with Jessie has also completely shifted the way I think about movement in ways I'm not sure I can put into words. During a really exhausting and overwhelming semester, this class was always a healing space. Another student wrote, "This class asked me to intensely, and at times with great difficulty, imagine a reality that I am tasked to create. Even as we critiqued, Christina asked us to present alternatives or to think how we would do X, Y, or Z differently. I have learned the breadth and limits of the ways I imagine. Jessie's facilitation of movement within the class cannot be understated. There were so many times that this part of the class reminded me to come with my whole self and not neglect my body or feelings, to take stock of the things that challenge me, that I'm grateful for, that I look forward to. I understood Christina and Jessie doing this together as an active way to shape scholarship dreams and practices differently, collectively, and even with family, blood, and beyond." Another student wrote, "In a time and place that continues to demand so much from Black folks, Black Speculative Futures has been a class that so generously gives back. The experience of being in a class composed almost entirely of folks in the Black diaspora, where we read and discussed works by radical Black leaders and scholars, is one wherein I'm able to come to class as my whole self and be met with empathy, generosity, and kinship. It's a type of caring so embedded in the classroom, the work, and the space that I didn't even realize I was missing in academia." Second to last one, another student wrote, "Every class, Professor Knight took such care in disrupting the boundary I've experienced throughout my education between academia and creativity, as well as expanding what I could consider to be future-making activities, like prose, poetry, reading, dreaming, movie making, dancing, resting, and joining a Zoom call every Tuesday to talk to cool people about how and where Black people exist in the future." And finally, "This course has been a sanctuary. We read together, we dream together, we encourage each other to talk to the ghosts and to trust in the messages of our ancestors. Black Speculative Futures is 3 hours a week on Zoom where I feel like I can breathe, where I feel connected to others, where I can imagine, forecast, co-create Black futures. That level of care in any course, under any circumstances, is precious and unique." So I wanted you to hear those words, Christina and Jessie, because I think it really is it's a testament to the space that you built this semester in your class and to the work that you're doing. And it also, I think, speaks so profoundly to what our mission is as well, in terms of integrating scholarship and creative practice as a form also of care, and you are much appreciated. Okay, so let me switch gears. I just want to give you a quick sense of how this event is going to go. Christina and Jesse will talk with us first about the broader Doomsday Project and about their work this semester. Then they're going to invite us to watch the short film they've developed, and we're going to put the link in the chat and you can watch it on your own devices. And then it's about 17 minutes long. So we'll all figure out when we're coming back together. And then they're going to talk a little bit about what we witnessed in the film. And then we'll open out for conversation, broader dialogue, and also feedback. Okay. All right, Christina and Jesse, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I don't know what to say in some ways, because that was such a generous gift of these responses from students. And I said I wasn't going to cry tonight, but I already have, so that's out of the way. But I will say one thing, which is just that we sort of had the feeling that when we embarked on this semester, that it would sort of change everything for us. And I have to say that in addition to be able to work on this project, in addition to that, working with the students has been the most important thing that we've done in recent memory. It has been extraordinary. And it has opened up a whole register of thinking about the future that I didn't know that I didn't have. And so I'm so grateful. I just, as a note in terms of how we're going to proceed now, Jesse's going to talk a little bit about just how we came to be Nightworks, just how we decided to come together and make this work as an academic and as a dancer choreographer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this trilogy that we've been making, centered on this idea of the end of the world. And then, of course, as Deb said, we'll share this rough cut of this film that we're so excited about. So with that, I guess I will pass the mic to Jesse.
Hi, everyone. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you today and sharing this incredible journey that has been the semester, but also this Nightworks journey that Christina and I began all the way back in the summer of 2011. Thematically, this is an important note, this next thing, which is that everything began with a dream that my sister had, a dream about being in the underworld. And that dream turned into a poem that she wrote on the summer solstice. And almost immediately we realized that we had some really fertile, magical thing happening that was calling us to work together. And we had this deeply rooted desire to create together in a way that we hadn't done, even though we're very close in age and, we grew up very, in a closely knit family. We'd never done any of the work together. And so she and I began to collaborate professionally for the first time. But we were working in two different ways and in two different spaces. I was dancing professionally with the Cleo Parker Robinson Ensemble, and she was in grad school. And we were living in different parts of the country since 2001. So this was a challenge, and we made it work though. We made it work in what felt oftentimes as fits and spurts. But we'd make time. She would carve out a couple of weeks to come down, and we would work really intensely and really hard for a while and then have to take a break. But after that first moment in 2011, we started to fast forward a little bit in this journey. And we had our first works in progress showing in the ARC at Duke University. And it was our first, go at it. That evolved into my premiering a solo titled I Mind, which is really the first juicy bit of the Doomsday trilogy as a whole. It was the first thing that came to the stage and came as a work on its own. I toured that then with the North Carolina Dance Festival. And as we started gaining momentum, we realized that we wanted a way to work together that was more cohesive than the way we were working. And we wanted to explore ideas on a larger scale and to tap into larger audiences and funding. And So we clearly needed to formalize our collaborations. And so that was where Nightworks really, when it was, born. Another important element of the Nightworks story is that after spending 4 years dancing professionally with a Black modern dance company, touring the works of Catherine Dunham and Alvin Ailey and all these, greats, I came back to the dance scene in North Carolina. And while it was, a different scale of working, I found a certain lack of voices and people creating work that looked or felt like me or us, and the voice that I had and the voice that we had emerging. And we wanted to see our stories. We have a very unique story, and we grew up mixed race children, low income, rural North Carolina. Our parents were both veterans, Air Force veterans. And then, sort of poignantly, one of the biggest moments for our younger selves was the death of our father while we were in high school. So from the beginning, we had this voice that we were feeling more than compelled to have heard. And we also realized in all of this work and all of this trying to put the pieces together for something cohesive that we could move forward with, we were realizing that this was so much more than just about making art. It was about this community that we were a part of, and we wanted to make the work that was personal and our truths, but not just about us. It wasn't enough to make interesting work or, entertainment or beauty, right? It wasn't enough just to be situated within a community. We felt like, especially in this political moment, we don't have the luxury of making art that isn't deeply connected to what it is we are, what it is we are as a community, as well as what it is that we are dreaming about as our future. We know that everyone can learn something from the stories of marginalized people. And that became sort of critical for us deciding, like, okay, so this is a really important moment for us. But we didn't really have what felt like something to stand on or a scaffolding underneath this. And so we started doing this work of deciding what it was what would sort of rules of engagement for how we were going to operate and how we were going to move this organization forward. So we carved out an idea called the tribe. And it is a set of guidelines for our intentional community. Our big questions are these. What does intimacy mean in the age of social media, especially now? What does kinship mean under these circumstances? And how are we as artists tapped into so many networks and still lacking a meaningful and engaged audience? Instead, we are going to ask, how can we create art that engages, addresses, and is accountable to our audience? And that sounds more like, how do we create a community, and a lot less like, how do we create art that assumes one in order to reach it? So our rules of engagement, the manifesto, so to speak. Number one, show up. Okay, show up. So personally, professionally, and all of the variations within, that's extremely challenging and has taken different forms of challenge over the past year, right? Number two, show up. It's not a typo. It is intended to be repeated. Showing up, it's critical. Without showing up, we have nothing else. We can't build on not being there. Number three, to act in a spirit of invitation, right? It's open, right? The more that we are open and the more we're connecting and the more we're building, the more we're sharing, the more resources are there and are there for everyone that's building with us. Number four, act in the knowledge that love multiplies, right? Love is not scarce. Love is exponential. Love is not an apple that you give to your neighbor and then are left one apple. Love is, I give this to you and I still have, and you have, and now you have to share and I still have to share. It's infinite. Number 5, a real critical one for both Christina and myself as sort of type A personalities and sort of anxious and, you know, high achieving people. Be afraid, do it anyways. Fear is information. And if you're a Dune lover, fear is a mind killer. Fear is the thing that paralyzes. Fear is information though, right? And fear is just another piece that you can use to move forward. Be afraid, do it anyways. Number 6, think on your feet. You know, everything's changing. That's the constant. Everything's changing. Everything's changing under our feet. And as many of our ancestors and aunties have said, pack light. That way you can move quickly, right? So we want to be adaptable. We want to be able to move, and we want to be able to shift when we need to. And then lastly, number 7 is to practice self-care. Both of us have found ourselves in situations in the past, 10 years where our health, our physical health, our mental health, our relationship health, all of these things have been, not okay. And without self-care, you can't care for the community that you're intentionally building. So those were our guidelines. That's what we decided, like, this is the way we're going to move forward. And it has been an integral part of the way we work on every single project. And we'll say more about how that's worked out in this Doomsday work a little bit later on. But Christina is going to share about what we're doing now and how we got to where we are now by way of this trilogy. Christina.
Thank you so much. Just hearing you talk about all that reminds me that we started Black Speculative Futures with Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown. And basically the idea that if you transform yourself, you transform the world. And it's so good to remember that we've been trying to move through space and through our work with that principle for so long. And that is the thing that comes before the work itself. That said, we have been actually working on stuff for some time. So for the past 5 years, we've been working on a trilogy on the idea of the end of the world. The first thing that we started with, Jesse alluded to earlier, was that I had a dream about going to the city of the dead. And we decided that that meant something to us. And as part of our process, it starts with a dream, it turns into a poem or a suite of poems. Then we start this kind of conversation and this collage process. And so the first piece that we came together to work on was called Eurydice Descended, was a retelling of the Orpheus and Eurydice myth, in part because we wanted some mythical framework in order to find ourselves in the city of the dead, basically. We were like, how do we get there? And we're like, Orpheus and Eurydice will take us there, and we can sort of, from there, connect it to our own personal stories and lives and experiences. How that sort of fit in with the idea of the end of the world in that piece was that we were thinking about one's death as the end of the world. So what happens when you pass away and everything that you sort of understood to be meaningful goes away. And also the fact that that's a dramatic framework that frames every single life. Every life ends, every life is a tragedy. If we can kind of accept that as the parameters, then you can start thinking about all the sparkling, beautiful stuff that happens in the middle. We also wanted to think about why it is that people of color are constantly returning to tragedy as a mode to think about their own lives and experiences in late capitalism. So we did that work. That was our first evening length work. That was in November of 2015. The second work that we did was called Spectacular Black Death. Again, started with a dream. Just woke up one morning and said the words Spectacular Black Death, wrote it down, called Jessie. She was like, ugh, not again, because at that point we didn't know it was going to be a trilogy. We didn't know we were going to sort of still be in the under. But that piece helped us explore something that I think has come out a lot in our more recent work and also in the class, which is that there's something about imagining the end of the world that also helps us imagine a word. And so in that piece, what we did is we called on our community, particularly women of color, and we asked them, if this is the end of, how are you using your life, your skills, your ideas, your dreams to make a new world? And we used that as the score for the piece. And that was also when I was living in Maine. And so we did that piece off the coast of Maine on this little island. Everyone had to get on a boat, but then we were surrounded by salt water. And so it also became a kind of homage to the Yoruba deity Yemaya, who's the Great Mother. So, we were starting to think about, again, the end of the world, of course, but then what comes next. The third piece in the trilogy, and it has to be the last piece, is called Doomsday. And that's a piece that began again with a dream, or a series of dreams, when I moved to Philadelphia. I started having these end of the world dreams, and they were very specific. It was like a flood one time, a chemical disaster another time. And what Jesse and I realized is that our late father also had dreams like that. And so we started to think about the ways that these kind of ideas and this kind of affective register of doom basically gets passed down intergenerationally. And being able to name it, I think, is one of the ways that you can kind of break outside of what feels like a kind of cycle. Specifically, when this piece is in its fullest form, it's going to be a doomsday church. It's going to be a space where essentially we're going to stage the end of the world so that we can imagine ourselves on the other side of it. And the plan is to be really engaged with ritual practice, and then also to constantly be in dialogue with Black feminist writing, which we always consider to be kind of future facing. So what we decided to do this semester, when we realized that we were not going to be able to gather, was that we decided to kind of pivot and turn it into a film project. And it actually ended up being very productive to do that, because it meant that we could sort of think differently about how collaboration works. Film is deterritorialized in some ways, and so our collaborations all of a sudden could sort of span out across region. It was also an opportunity to start thinking about ourselves in relationship to the idea of anthropology. In some ways, that opened up something for us. Because of the proximity of the center to the anthropology department, we started to think about embodiment, multimodal work. And for us, the way that we decided to work with that in Doomsday Field Notes was that the premise is that an anthropologist from the future finds this drive that sort of documents these little pieces of this Doomsday Church. And it allows that anthropologist, or us by way of that anthropologist, to think about what this moment is. Another thing that I love about anthropology is that it allows you to sort of provincialize your own perspective, the way that you move through the world. And so we decided to use that as a kind of dramatic framework in Doomsday Field Notes. I will say one more thing, which is that this fellowship allowed us to be, as you've heard, in dialogue with this cadre of brilliant students whose own ideas then got kind of incorporated into the sort of fabric of this work. We were able to together deeply read all of these makers engaging the Black speculative. So sometimes working in an Afrofuturist register, other times working in sort of Black science fiction, and then even thinking about kind of Black critical theory as future facing. And then finally, we got to really engage, as you've heard, the physical register, really thinking about what the body knows and what it means to sort of be moving together, even though we're all so separate. And so I don't want to say too much more about Doomsday Field Notes, because of course you're going to view it and have your own opinions. But what I will say is that our editor is Yashaswi Dixit. She's an MFA student at Temple. This is a very rough cut. And so you guys are some of the very first people to see it. So we'll be super excited to get any feedback and thoughts on what you've seen. So I think with that, we will drop the link in the chat. So the link is about 17 minutes long. So the idea is, again, that you will just go watch it on your own devices and come back. Have I missed anything?
No, so let's plan to come back at 5:53 or somewhere close to that. Okay. Okay.
November 15th, year 2070. I suppose I shouldn't call this section conclusions when I'm left with so many questions. However, the feeling that lingers, or the hunch that I want to explore, is that the two dancing women may be sisters, and they sit at the center of either an arts practice or a religious practice, or a combination of the two, and one, or both, may have also been attached to the academy. Given the title of the files, Doomsday, and their contents, it seems that the women either intuited the coming of the cataclysm or may have simply explored apocalypse as a theme in an embodied course of study. Because of the social and environmental context of the 20s, apocalypse was a popular theme, not simply in academia, but also in much of popular culture at that time. And yet, my training in the intuitive arts suggests that the files do not simply represent a scholarly concern with cataclysmic shifts. Instead, I may need to take each object seriously as an occult practice, as a doing. In other words, what were the women making or unmaking? What did Doomsday mean to them? And where do the students fit in? If they somehow could understand something about this time in their own, what did they want me to see in this material? Why does this future need to know about that past? And is their doomsday destined to repeat? November 7th, year 2070. Drive contents unencrypted and provisionally annotated. Observation Note 1. This is a digital video of what appears to be a ritual or performance on a rooftop in what may have been the borough of Brooklyn, New York City, in the state of New York. The date, according to the timestamp, falls in November of 2020. A statuesque, fair-skinned black woman steps into the frame. Slowly and methodically, she lays the cloth onto the ground, steps into the middle, and then drops into a seated position. The woman places the two bowls symmetrically with the candle in the middle onto the cloth. She pours the clear liquid in one bowl, brown liquid in the other, and with hand pressed together, she closes her eyes and in a low bow towards the offering, she silently prays. From there, she rises and performs a series of movements. They seem to be intentional, but also slightly improvised. She moves in graceful repetitions, her arms bent, her hands in delicate gestures that twist, flick, point, and stir, while her body moves in counterclockwise circles, moving again and again and again towards the middle of the cloth. The woman retrieves a paper from the notebook and reads from it. I'm not familiar with all of the sources, but a few come from what has been called a Black feminist tradition. I recall that this was before there was a push to undiscipline and to deterritorialize the academy in the decades of the 2030s and the 2040s. The woman concludes the ritual by returning to the makeshift altar and then, in 3 small counterclockwise circles, blows out the candle. Analysis. Why the organizers chose a rooftop for the ritual is unclear. Equally unclear is whom the ritual is for. Audience members do not appear in the frame. Perhaps the video was for online distribution? Additionally, why the color palette of red and black? Elements of the rituals resemble African diasporic spiritual practices from the Yoruba, particularly, as well as its offshoots in Brazil and Cuba. But the ritual itself seems piecemeal, fashioned from disparate elements. Most of all, I wonder about the decision to film amidst the social unrest of that time. Though documentation of the historical period is uneven, given what happened shortly afterwards, I can't help but to wonder, did this woman feel safe? Did she choose the rooftop for its obscurity or for its aesthetics? Or did she simply need access to open sky?
One. They dug in their memories for the one day. For some of them, it was a couple of days per month. Rock bottom days. The days in their lives when the world had already ended. They thought back and asked, what did we each do then? On the day that everything went wrong, when transportation and communication technologies conspired against us individually, when we personally couldn't get out of bed, dehydrated with crying, when we didn't ask for help, when we hurt the people we loved, when the sun died, when we lost everything, when we lost exactly who we needed to save, when we knew there would be no tomorrow. What did we each do then? How do we keep breathing past it because we are the ones that did? They dug for those memories and stacked them in a row. That's how. That's how we learned how to get through this. Alexis Pauline Gumbs, M-Archive, After the End of the World. 2. Transform yourself to transform the world. I want a future where we are curious, interested, visionary, adaptive. How do we prepare not just for suffering, but for sharing and innovation? The future is not an escapist place to occupy. Our lives are our life's work. It is our right and responsibility to write ourselves into the future. Adrienne Maree Brown, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds. 3. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Octavia Butler, Parable of the Sower. 4. Am I doing enough to weaponize my desire? Stephanie Jemison, Black Utopias. 5. If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression. The Combahee River Collective Statement. 6. I want to write down everything I know about being afraid, but I'd probably never have enough time to write anything else. Afraid is a country where they issue us passports at birth and hope we never seek citizenship in any other country. The face of afraid keeps changing constantly, and I can count on that change. I need to travel light and fast, and there's a lot of baggage I'm going to have to leave behind me. Jettison cargo. Audre Lorde, A Burst of Light, Living with Cancer. 7. If unfinished liberation is the still to be achieved work of abolition, then at bottom, what is to be abolished isn't the past or its present ghost, but rather the processes of hierarchy, dispossession, and exclusion that congeal in and as group differentiated vulnerability to premature death. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Abolition, Geography, and the Problem of Innocence. 8. As a Black woman feminist, I must look about me with trembling and with shocked anger at the endless waste, the endless suffocation of my sisters. The bitter sufferings of hundreds of thousands of women who are the sole parents, the mothers of hundreds of thousands of children, the desolation and the futility of women trapped by demeaning, lowest-paying occupations, the unemployed, the bullied, the beaten, the battered, the ridiculed, the slandered, the trivialized, the raped, and the sterilized, the lost millions and multi-millions of beautiful, creative, and momentous lives turned to ashes on the pyre of gender identity. I must look about me, and as a Black feminist, I must ask myself, where is the love? How is my own life work serving to end these tyrannies, these corrosions of sacred possibility? June Jordan, where is the love?
Observational Note 2. The second file to be unencrypted proved to be a series of 3 digital images. The drawings appear to be in the style of Rider-Waite tarot cards. The first, titled only Doomsday, depicts 3 women on a road looking up at a night sky where planets and the moon form an eerie straight line, all in grayscale. The second, titled The Unmaker, depicts a solar eclipse in a red scale. And the third, called The Woman Dressed in Stars, depicts a seated, highly adorned woman of color in a pink head wrap. Her dress, as the title suggests, is purple and covered in stars. The chair is also a purple wicker and high-backed. The scene is outdoors in a fuchsia twilight. November 1st, 2070. Today I received a box without a postmark. Enclosed was an external hard drive labeled Doomsday. This box, dusty but not damaged, was addressed to me from an area once known as New York State. It is part of a larger parcel distributed from the university's ongoing efforts to record what happened on the East Coast during the years 2020 and 2021. This box is of particular interest to me because dating suggests that the label, which includes my title, institution, and address, was written months before the cataclysm. What makes this more than puzzling is that my birth didn't occur for another decade. We've since come to understand much more about the elasticity of time, but even my physicist colleagues couldn't chart 50 years into the future. For that, you would still need a crystal ball. All jokes aside, My hope is that understanding the data on the drive will help me to make sense of the context of that moment. But I also hope to unravel my own relationship to the box and its unknown contents.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So now I know you have some things you would like to share with us about that.
Well, I actually just want to be a little bit mindful of time, and I definitely want to leave enough time for Q&A, but I will just say, because there's no credits in this rough cut, that I just wanted to shout out the folks that collaborated on this work. So our cinematographers, Nadia Awad and Alex Manis, the supremely talented artist, Sarah Welch, who did our tarot cards. The anthropologist from the future is voiced by Julie Grigsby, who is very much an anthropologist in the present and my dear friend and colleague. And then, of course, the students from Black Speculative Futures who really lent their spirits and bodies to this project. So it's been such a labor of love. I would just love to open it up to questions, or if you specifically have a question, Deb, I don't know.
Sure.
We're excited.
Sorry?
Just we're excited for any feedback, basically.
Yeah, no, it was beautiful. And I love the use of the anthropologist, of course, in the sense of thinking what this time could really mean in the future, and then what our ancestral memories might bring back from it in terms of the movement structures, the tarot cards. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your decision to mobilize multiple traditions in thinking about the visual and the movement structures in the film.
I can start, but I'm sure Jesse will jump in specifically around these questions of choreographic choices. I will say that we're almost always working in a pretty collage process. And I think part of that impulse really is just feeling as though there are lots of different traditions that have fed into the people that we are. And I think that as I've grown older and come into contact with more and more traditions, I'm finding that that they're all available in a certain way. And I don't mean that in a kind of appropriative fashion, but I suppose I mean, for instance, when I was in graduate school and found myself in Brazil learning my orishas, all of a sudden that became a part of my personal cosmology. And then later in life, when I found tarot cards, it just became another way to access my own ancestors, even though tarot isn't necessarily a tradition that belongs to me or my kin. And likewise, I think with astrology, it became another way to sort of access spirit, I suppose. Although I would love to hear from Jesse too, because I know that this has a different kind of quality when it comes to pulling from different movement traditions.
Right. Well, I mean, I went what I felt like was to a place of my footing being how I move, right? And that is exactly what you were saying, Christina, before, which is that how I move comes out of many layers of both who I am as a physical being, who I came from, and as well as what training I've had, what creating I've done, and what that's lent itself to, and how it's lent itself to my particular voice. I have a lot of training in various, forms, but this piece, as you said, as being the sort of collage way of creating and generating, I have found my fullest voice by being able to tap into those places. So a lot of that soft knees, undulating bodies, like it absolutely comes from a West African tradition that I, spent a lot of time doing, but it also comes from a softness and a feeling of me generating and working and evolving a character that is softness and is undulation and is energetically these things. So, of course you must stay mindful of where you're pulling from and how you're citing, so to speak. But I think there's there are these blurred lines that is everything that I am, right? I'm part of this world of Blackness. I'm part of this world of whiteness. I'm part of this world that's academia. I'm part of this world that's hardworking industry folks. I'm part of, my very existence is that. And allowing myself to tap into these sort of transmutable boundaries, right? We don't have to stay in these places, and they feed into each other. And that's how imagining my future looks like, is allowing myself to be this very cohesive amalgamation of bits and pieces and experiences. And that goes so far as to say that, my choreographic journey takes me through Christina's dreams and my dreams, and are working it out like siblings do, where we don't agree on a thing, but we, have our shared sort of sister speak, where we can cut to the chase and get to these ideas without even having to completely formulate them into words. I think there's it's taken me a while to really wrap my head and my hands around it, but I have an amazing, library, so to speak, of things to draw from and people to draw from. And I think that the way I work is me honoring the fact that I am all of these pieces. Yeah.
I'll just add one little thing, which is that, just in my training, I guess, in African American studies and learning specifically about kind of what the Middle Passage did to the kind of ancestral meaning or memory that we have and that we have carried with us. I think one lesson that I learned early on, for instance, is that, the Yoruba traditions that we know so well are in part because they were the easiest for other people to learn, right? So it's like there's certain things that you could carry on your back and that you could teach really quickly to other people that then became a kind of new cultural practice in the new world. And so I think when, I'm not a choreographer, but I do work in the idiom of ritual. And so, that rooftop ritual was a performance, but it was also an actual ritual. And one of the gestures, for instance, at the very end of my movement comes from Omorum, who's like in the Yoruba tradition. And, he puts his hand down, he puts his hand up, he puts his hand down. And it's like, he's a figure that's associated with plague. It's like in Brazil, people covered themselves with popcorn, to keep plague away and to sort of make offerings to him. So for me at this moment of, COVID, doing this ritual on this rooftop, I'm like, that's one of the pieces that I want to use and want to invoke, because those spirits still respond, there's a kind of enormous power, as long as one is careful to be respectful and to make sure that you're not just taking in a kind of a colonial way. But if you're listening, all these elements are kind of available to you. So that was a very lengthy answer to a beautiful question.
I would also like to add that, some of the things that came and that were used both in the student movement and both of our movements were some very practical hand gestures, right? The learning curve of working on Zoom has taken me down rabbit holes of how to more visually communicate when I can't be in the same space and generate that same reciprocity and that same understanding. And so, one of the more basic things that I picked up was, these hand signals, right? I have a question, right? Or I disagree, or, I would like to add something to that, right? These were actual things that I was, had in my teaching log notebook, right? The log is how do I make this accessible? How do I, and you don't have to be a dancer to say I love you in sign language, right? You don't have to. So there was another more baseline movement underneath that for me, which was just yeah, but also part of me is not about this magic. It's about the practicality around it that allows for that magic to be there. So that was the one thing to add for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm gonna take moderator's privilege, I guess, and ask you another question. And I'm sure others also have questions. So as you're thinking about how you want to engage everybody, you can either indicate in the chat that you have a question, or you can, I think you can raise your blue hand, and Annie and Elisa will be looking out for that, and so will I. But I wanted to sort of pick up on two things that you all just said. Jessie, you mentioned citation, and you were talking about it in relation to dance, in relation to movement structures. I mean, you know, you said Yoruba, I saw Yanvalu, you know, and I think there are multiple sort of citational qualities that we saw through the movement structures. But then, Christina, you were also using citation, right? In part of your ritual, you were citing Black feminist scholars. And what was striking about both of those forms of citation to me was the way they were framed intergenerationally, or we could think about them as being framed intergenerationally, like just in the sense of the Yoruba movements that you're talking about. We can think about them as part of a Yoruba ritual process in what is now Nigeria. We can also think about them being modified, as you said, through the Middle Passage in the New World to take on different shapes and forms in Brazil, in Cuba, in Puerto Rico, in Haiti, you know, but those are descendants in a way. And some of the generational citation you were doing, Christina, also made me think of who are my, you know, spiritual writing mothers, aunties, grandmothers, and descendants, also my nephews, nieces, cousins, you know, peers. But then in a way, at the very end, you're traveling in the other direction. And so you spoke about memory a minute ago, Christina, and I think you know, you're evoking a kind of historical legacy, both of you. You're invoking a kind of ancestral memory through movement, through ritual practice, through actual text. But then you also are having a memory of the future somehow, because you have sent this box to Julie, or to who the anthropologist Julie represents. So it made me wonder how to think about intergenerational memory in a non-linear transmission way, as something that moves to the future as well as moving to the past. I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what is the sense of time you're trying to evoke?
I mean, I think there's a number of different ways to approach that question. I think one of the ways is that in my experience of ancestral work, my understanding is that the healing that you do to yourself both moves forward in time towards your descendants, but then also heals the people that came before. So that's one of the ways that it sort of scrambled my thinking about sort of Western concepts of time. But also, I think there's a part of my academic project that is really trying to rethink ideas of time that came out of the Enlightenment. So the idea of time as linear and cumulative is actually pretty recent historically. And I think that it's one of the sort of scams of capitalism, in part just to make time feel like it's, you know, it's adding up to something. And so one of the things that we've really talked about in the class is like, why is it that all these like Black speculative, you know, culture makers are trying to break time in their work, and how are they doing that? You know, whether it's in film or whether it's in, you know, using sort of non-linearity in writing, but a lot of them are trying to do that. And I think some of it's that they're trying to break this idea of Western time that we're all trapped in a certain way, how to decolonize that. I don't know if you would answer that in a different way, Jessie.
I don't know. I mean, I'd liken it to how this whole process tends to work for us, which is that we were talking about this work and what it is long before we had a thing, right? We decided what it, you know, we wrote our future. We already knew, I mean, we didn't know in detail what it was, but there's this idea that, you know, you're speaking it into existence, and by virtue of speaking the thing happens or is or becomes. I don't know, I feel like that's a little of a loopy way to say it, but I mean, it was kind of funny to look at it like that. Like, we had this whole funny sister conversation where we're like, so, you know, we don't have a thing yet. So how are we gonna, okay, we have a gap now. We have this great idea and we have no thing. And we've been talking it up, and we even have a showing on December 3rd of this thing. What's the thing? And there's a beauty and there's a terror in that at the same time. But we spoke it in, and we worked through in these circuitous ways back around again. And by way of, you know, our work together and then our work in the class and all the elements that came whooshing in at different times, somehow it's a thing. You saw the thing that we did.
Yeah, actually early on in our process, we got really caught up in the idea of like recursiveness, you know, so not just repeating things, but that you're solving tiny little problems, and that each time you're solving like the bigger problem by repeatedly solving these small problems. And so one of the ways that we do that is by bringing in collaborators, I think. So each time we sort of pitch the project, we start to fix a little problem, because then they start dreaming the thing too. And then we have a crew when we're approaching the next person. Like we have these tarot cards, and then so when we're at the cinematographer, we have like something. But I like that there's something about that, the idea of recursion, that helps us break out of the idea that we have to just be like working towards this outcome, which is an especial pressure for, I think, artists, because you're always trying to like come up with some genius object. And I actually think what we're more invested in is like this idea of process. It's like the most generative, exciting part of what we do is just the community again that we build and the conversations that we end up having along the way.
Well, that's evident in the principles you outlined for Nightworks, right? That it's really about bringing it into being through the process of working together and not having something directed ahead of time that forecloses other kinds of options that might develop. I see that there is a question from John Muse. Could you try to unmute yourself?
Could you kill your audio? Yeah, so hi y'all. And Vicki and I are in the same room, which means we're gonna have if we have technical difficulties, we'll work it out. So I think I have 3 observations, and there's a question in here. So I just wanna note how beautiful and moving the moment is when the students arrive in this film. And I'm trying to figure out the ways in which the power of that, the way I feel it. And one has to do with something Jesse already said, when the laundry basket becomes the occasion for bending over, right? Like that becomes very clear that this entire choreography is both oriented to a beyond and an elsewhere, and a before and an after in some kind of tangled knot, but also to the most mundane, making it happen of life as it's being lived. And what I really appreciate about the way that moment falls into the piece is that it seems to evade capture by the anthropologist, who is also leading us and giving us a perspective on what we're seeing. And it's never mentioned. It's not mentioned that this is happening. And so it's living in a different space and time than the space and time of the archive as gripped and read by the anthropologists of the future. And that to me was like, you know, a deeply moving, deeply resonant, that I did not expect to happen. And I appreciate that you broke the grammar that you had established to introduce that. And I'm just, you know, so there's some affection for what that was. And I just wanted to give you that feedback. The other observation, this is maybe a note in the sense of like what a note is in theater and film. I think I would be excited to hear you talk about, or to hear voiced, the kind of eclipse of the camera as a viewer. In other words, the camera is doing things that are not noted by the anthropologist, that the anthropologist probably would note. Who is behind this camera? Why is there a cut here? Why does it move in certain ways? And the reason that, that may just be cute and sort of just Brechtian, but I think the suggestion is that it ties into this notion of transmissibility, that this is being seen and staged and captured by someone for someone. And I begin thinking then about the difference between the two scenes, the rooftop scene and the nighttime scene, or the twilight scene, and really trying to understand day and night and the oppositions of, cityscape and the quasi-rural or landscape. And I just think there's some richness in what it means to have filmed this, what it means that someone was doing so, and that we never see that person. That there's a kind of question and transmission that might also be complicated in the sense of the camera's own agency, either as an independent, completely autonomously moving something, or as handled by someone that maybe can't be trusted. And my third observation is very quick, which is I really appreciate that the anthropologist is both receiving something and missing something. And I think the noir version of this film is that the anthropologist thinks they've missed something, but in fact their entire life has been already affected by the very thing that they think they've discovered, right? Like that sense of the noir ending where the detective always discovers that he, and it's always he in fact was the murderer all along. Like, I'm following the traces, I'm following the clues, and they all point to me, and oh my God, I'm the one who did it. So, yes, La Jetée, that's right. So that's that whole like future, that knot of the future that might include the anthropologist not simply as witness, but as somehow the one who is actually in trouble. Okay, so that was an observation and a love letter, but also then some notes. So if you have comments, I would love to hear them, but thanks so much.
Thank you.
I will just jump in, and then Jesse, of course, you will jump into that moment with the students. I mean, we obviously were going to put the students in somewhere, but actually it was kind of Yasheswi's editing prowess. For some reason, I don't know what it is. It was exactly the right thing. We wanted the students to pop up in the middle, but somehow she got it right during MArchive also, which somehow she just intuited was the right moment for them to crop up. And the way that she made the screen look like a Zoom screen, it's very moving to us too. And we're still trying to sort out like all the ways that works in the middle, I think, of the film. In terms of this issue, I guess, of who's behind the camera and how the anthropologist is or isn't noticing, I do have to say that some of this was like the slight tension between the script that I wrote and the fact that Julie is an actual anthropologist. And so she got the script and then she was like, wait, an anthropologist wouldn't say this. Like, so she had to like rewrite a lot. And then we weren't finished with all the objects yet when she had to sort of record the voiceover. And so in some ways, this isn't quite the same thing that it would be if she had all the objects and could have just written it herself, which would have been quite a task to ask of someone, at the end of a semester during COVID on Zoom. But I do like that is an issue, and that is something to think more about. It's just like, what would an anthropologist who was really closely paying attention to media, what would that person miss? What would that person get? And then of course, adding 50 years and just who knows like what it means to be looking back at media from 50 years prior. I'm not sure about this last question. I love that. I mean, I think I love this kind of question mark at the end, in part because I think if we had been left to our own devices, I don't know that we would have moved backwards in time in the way that Yasheswi decided to do, but I love that she did that. And it does raise a bunch of questions at the end about who, what the anthropologist is, how they're enmeshed, I guess, in this world. But what do you think, Jessie?
I don't know. I mean, we're working on so many timescales with both the camera, both with the creation of the bits that are being filmed and with our whole lives. And so, I don't know, I have a real difficult time wrapping my head around that, but I think there are still some questions and some things to be zeroed in on. I mean, you know, it is yet to be finished. And, you know, these are really powerful places to put some energy into in terms of shaping, like, you know, shaping it out to its finished form.
Thanks. I see that Robin Riskin has a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Hi. Yeah, I don't know where to begin. This was a really moving experience for me. And I feel like this could even be a private conversation, but seeing how you opened in the students' personal comments at the beginning, I thought I would follow suit. So I'm actually an alum of Haverford, but somehow I never came across your classes, Christina, while I was there. But actually John and Vicky were both my teachers, and it's so wonderful to see them here. And I'm now doing my PhD in art curating in Ghana at KNUST in Kumasi. And I also have some friends on the chat here from Ghana, friends and mentors, Stephen Feld and Alyssa. And my parents are also watching upstairs. So this is like a very like interconnected space for me. And this work that you did, just like your student said, it opened up an intellectual space for them that they didn't know existed. And that they were missing. This is like something I have been searching for, that I'm like struggling with in my own PhD work, how to have a space like between modernist intellectual disciplines and fields, and then more ancient, what have been called like indigenous practices, by which I like to think of as sciences. And these like ritual and healing and body-mind connections you're bringing in, and how to have a space that encompasses or like includes both intellectual growth and personal growth and experience, and how these are knotted together. This was just like, wow. So, and some of the arguments you're talking about are also really related to mine, shifting the emphasis from like capitalist products to process. And yeah, so I think I would love to have a conversation with you guys later.
Definitely.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you're a Haverford alum. That's so exciting. And I will say one thing, just because, you know, I struggled through a PhD as well, and that there's a lot about PhD training that forecloses this kind of thinking, you know, and I think for us, we didn't actually arrive at this kind of work really until, or we didn't really find the way to make this kind of work until after I was out of the PhD, because I was constantly being disciplined in certain ways about how to think in a way that was rigorous, you know. And so I guess all I'm saying, and of course we can talk about this more later, but is that there's, you know, there's other entry points, you know, that you'll find, particularly after you make your way out of that disciplining process that is the PhD, which is meant, of course, to professionalize you in certain ways. But I also have hope that there's some undisciplining happening within PhD programs, and that sometimes, you know, you can find little ways to do that work within the program itself, which it sounds like your interests are already doing in some ways. But just to give you like a little bit of hope, you know, that there's space. Yeah.
And just to clarify, I love my program, and I would want to give a shout out to Black Star Lines Kumasi. This is where I got it all from, but now I'm trying to take it in my own directions, and I love seeing how you guys are doing it.
Speaking of undisciplining, I love how you decided that the university will be deterritorialized in the 2030s and 2040s. And I was wondering what that looks like to you.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. But I guess there is a kind of freedom dream in there somewhere. I think mostly because of coming out of, you know, African-American studies at the same time that I was being disciplined in art history, and finding oftentimes those things at odds, because art history is such an old and, you know, frankly, colonial kind of discipline. And it's not only that, it has so much other possibilities, but in Black study, thinking about interdisciplinarity and thinking about the ways that our objects demand a kind of versatility and demand a kind of ability to think historically and to not just constantly do this maintenance around what the discipline is. And so I don't know. I mean, I guess in some ways there's work happening in classes like Black Speculative Futures where we're trying to plant these seeds in our students in the hopes that they'll be the architects of this work in 10, 15, 20 years. And so in some ways, this is a little love letter to that process, which is just like, I don't yet know, because I was trained in the way that I was trained, what an undisciplined or deterritorialized academy would look like. But I have a little feeling about what kind of student could dream that, and I've sort of seen that already this semester. So.
Yeah. Jessie, do you want to say anything about deterritorialization?
Not really. I mean, I haven't spent as much time and definitely haven't achieved a PhD, but in working at the university level and teaching dance, teaching movement, I at a certain point felt the boundaries of what that could look like for me, at a certain point, and realized that this isn't quite the box that I'm ready to be fully engaged with, because I don't, I still have this work, this deterritorializing work on self to do before I was ready to confront this monolith that is the stronghold of the academic way of moving.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the goal, yes, is to, to undiscipline in the broadest sense. Of course, it's not just an academic pursuit, we must undiscipline ourselves, our taken for granted around time, around space, around Western modernity. I think that undisciplining and deterritorializing is really, something that your work clearly does, but also it's a process that we all must undertake in whatever sphere, in which we're interacting. I know Elisa has a question, and it might be the last one. So go ahead, Elisa.
Hi, Christina and Jessie. Thank you guys so much for bringing this work and this energy to the students here and becoming a part of this project that we ourselves are trying to do. You guys have your own projects, obviously. So just thank you, first of all. It was such a beautiful work. And I'm so fascinated personally, and also intellectually, by the work that you're doing in dreaming, by dreaming as a work, and how you guys are really mobilizing that. Both of you have mentioned dreams and your own ancestral history of your father's dreams. And I'm really fascinated because dreaming is such a space where you can engage with, if you're a conscientious dreamer, if you can remember your dreams, as some people can, it's a place where you can really engage with the visual and sensorial elements of like multi-temporal spaces or different kinds of time and different kinds of flows. So I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about that.
Jessie, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think that Christina and I both zeroed in on how the potential for the power of dreaming in terms of our work a long time ago, but hadn't up until recent past found that space to be able to voice it within the work. And one of the things about dreaming, and one of the things that is so deeply resonant with me about why dreaming is important, is because it's one of those tools in a toolbox that we all already have. And so if you have a tool but you don't know how to use it, so sure, you just, you can have them and it not matter, right? But if you already have it, like, there's a lot of power in the thing if you know how to use it, right? And if we all have it, and it has all these shades and levels and gradations of where they exist in your timeline or or in your time space, right? And how they connect with other people and how they connect you with, you know, the rest of us, the rest of the people around you, how communal dreaming happens is a thing that we can tap into. It's just, you know, it's just this untapped resource that, you know, I was like, well, shoot, if we, you know, if this is this thing that's so powerful, which we've both experienced that, you know, individually and working together, gosh, there's like this potential that feels really, you know, super powerful, you know, and that's super, you know, I get like really excited thinking about that. I can say to my students, that dream that you had about this thing that we're talking about, even though you can't necessarily articulate it, once you start diving into what that is, that connects you to all the things before it and after it. And the thing that it's, you know, that's coming from me, I was, you know, that it feels like almost too amazing for it to be a thing that we can use, right? But it's not, I mean, it may be magic and, you know, but it is a thing it's a thing, we have it. And as someone who doesn't have a lot, you know, and who's struggling with a lot of different things and living in a time where so many of us are struggling, to be able to say that, you know, be easy though, you have this place where you can design something different for yourself. That feels like one of those things I have to, that's my work right now. I have to, you have the tool to tell all my students and all my friends and to live that way. You have this tool. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. I am going to say that I lied earlier and give Amber Henry the last question, and then we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Deb. Thank you both for this wonderful piece of just food for mind and spirit and creativity. So I really appreciate it, what you just shared. I want to share two things that I enjoyed and then also a thank you and connecting it back to the manifesto that you shared in the beginning of the opening, which was really, really powerful. So I really appreciated how the piece asked us to think about how we write about our normal, our world from a position that's otherworldly. And I'd love to hear you all speak about what that was like, to speak about our familiar as strange and what that was like for you in terms of talking about this moment as if it's completely new and unfamiliar. Something that I really appreciated was that there wasn't a closed loop between the present and the future. So although we are having anthropologists read back into the past and understand what she's seeing, there are things that are missed, as John said, right? So there are citations that she's not understanding, maybe that's from Black feminist thought. But then also there are things that from the present we can't see, and in terms of the letter, I mean the hard drive arriving and not knowing how it got into the future. And what I enjoy about that moment in particular is it really shows the productivity of an unclosed loop, right? Because what's missed then falls upon us, kind of in that Brechtian sense, right? The viewer thinking about, okay, well, how are those moments drawn together? Well, we have to make some of those connections, whether it's the de-disciplinizing in 2030. We have to kind of imagine what things would possibly close that loop. And then finally, as you were talking about the process of making this piece, you mentioned, Christina, fixing small problems as a method. So how do we invite small problems as a way of letting us then be more creative? And that really resonated with one of my favorite items on the manifesto, which was be afraid, do it anyway. And that fear is information and productive. And I think that the process of creating this piece also invited fear as a praxis for creativity. So anything in that you want to speak back to, but just thank you so much. And I'm really glad that work like this exists.
Thank you for that series of really beautiful reflections. I think to sort of touch on a couple of things that you said, like it was sort of daunting in some ways to try to think about this historical moment through the lens of doomsday while we were, of course, like waiting for election results and while we've been living through COVID. And I think on the one hand, because we've been dealing with this idea of the end of the world and for so long, actually, long before Trump actually was in office and all of that, that was helpful in some ways. But I think something that we're trying to think through is just that part of just being human in time is that like, or maybe just being alive in time, whether you're human or non-human, is that like you're opened up to contingency, just vast contingency. And I always tell this story about being an undergrad and learning about evolution and like feeling like I understood things through like the survival of the fittest. And then one day there was this lecture about the sort of contingency that killed the dinosaurs. And so the slide that the professor showed was just this dinosaur looking behind it. And there's like this tidal wave coming because of this comet that, or this meteor that hit the earth. And he was like, people don't realize, but like, what shapes the way that things develop is that these unpredictable things happen and they shift everything, And I still see that image in my head of the dinosaur. It was like a brontosaurus looking behind it. And so I think there's something about this work that is balancing that feeling that like, this feels like this moment is this tremendous shift and that something really scary is just under the surface that may or may not have anything to do with COVID or may not have anything to do with 45. And I think holding that in tension with the fact that Black people specifically, but of course, Indigenous folks have endured cataclysm, over time, and they've built culture and they've made art and they've raised babies, and so part of like the grounding of the Black feminist tradition is remembering that like we keep moving, we keep making, and so we try to like think about cataclysm, but we also try to think about what comes next. And so it's a problem and a tension in our work that we don't resolve on purpose. It's a productive kind of friction, I think, to hold those things kind of together.
Yeah, Christina, excellent. And real quick, just to speak back to something that you just said, what I love about this piece that you all are continuing to formulate is that it invites me to think about the end of the world as a ritual welcoming in of something new, right? So what is productive about the end of the world? Because the fact that there's an anthropologist 50 years later speaking back, and there are physicist colleagues, the academia is alive and well 50 years later after the end of the world in this iteration that you all are painting for us. So, right, thinking about the end of the world as a ritualistic welcoming in of something new, and what do we want to bring with us? And then of course I also thought of like the end of whose world, or the end of the world for whom, because if this individual in the video is at least is bringing these citations or these practices with her into the future, then there are some things that are surviving and helping to usher in a new world. So yeah, love that end of the world as ritual for new birth.
Thanks for that, Amber. I hear dinner being prepared behind you, and that's something that I have to do as well. And I'm sure many of you are sort of headed to that next moment in the day. I just want to thank Christina and Jesse so very much for sharing this work, for being in conversation with us, for engaging the students so beautifully and creating the space that you created with them, and for inspiring us to show up and show up again, and to be afraid but do it anyway. And it's really, what you've shared with us here is really such a model and such an inspiration, I think, for many of us who are here. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and remember also again to join us again on Tuesday, when we will be able to hear from our other center fellow for the fall semester, Steve Feld, on hearing heat. Okay, thank you everybody, and good night.
Good night.